Hey, Advanced Art, welcome back. There's a lot of stuff on the agenda for today, and I want to be sure you go through the stuff in order. So, if you have not already answered the check-in question, please stop this, go back, answer the check-in question, then come back here. Don't worry, I'll wait. Okay, great. Welcome back. In just a minute, you are going to see a video about an artist named Edward Hopper. And even if you don't know the name, I'm guessing that a lot of you will be familiar with some of his work. There's one piece in particular called Nighthawks. It's got several people sitting in a diner in New York City late at night. I'm guessing that if you've never seen the actual painting, you've probably seen other pieces of art that are homages or takeoffs of that. It's incredibly well known, and it's been duplicated in movies and in TV shows and in other pieces of art. And anyway, a couple years ago when I was in New York City, I actually got to visit Edward Hopper's studio. And in the video you're going to watch, some of those things you see in there are places that I actually got to be in, and I'll actually be putting up some photos of it here, right here as I'm talking, to kind of show you what I saw, and then you'll recognize a little bit of this in the video. But we're going to have you watch. It's just about 8 minutes long. It was created in conjunction with an exhibition of Hopper's work, but it includes some good background information and just some good information about his work, which is going to tie in with what you're going to be working on next. So we'll take a look at the Hopper video, and then I'll come back and have some more stuff for you.
This is an exhibition devoted to Edward Hopper's oil paintings and watercolors and a number of his prints. It's the first comprehensive exhibition of Hopper's work to be seen in Washington in over 25 years. Hopper was born in Nyack, New York in 1882, but he really was a New York City person. He lived all of his life virtually in New York. The Hopper that we know today, perhaps many people are most familiar with these images of urban scenes in New York. Ironically, in light of the fame of his later scenes of urban America, his first great success really came through watercolors of New England subjects. Hopper did spend most of his life living in New York City, lived in Greenwich Village. Hopper's New York is a very different place. It's recognizably New York or any great American city, but it's a kind of anonymous place, often very quiet, often empty, sometimes with people, sometimes not. Did Hopper focus on the new, the modern, the today? There's always a sense that the buildings he shows, the scenes he shows, have been there for a while. They're not new. They're places that people have inhabited and have become familiar. The places that Hopper was drawn to in his paintings in New York were anonymous places often, or places that weren't necessarily the sort of immediate thing you'd think of as a subject for a painting. Hotel rooms or lobbies, restaurants, not fancy restaurants, or rather plain-looking shop fronts or rows of buildings on streets where you see nothing that's any kind of landmark that would tell you where they were. But Hopper seemed to love them. He seemed to be drawn to their quiet beauty. A good example is the wonderful painting of 1929 called Chop Suey, which shows a corner of a restaurant very like one that we know Hopper and his wife Jo liked to go to. It was a second-floor walk-up establishment, probably very inexpensive, where you got nice, good Chinese food. And Hopper shows us, and he shows a couple of people at the tables, but it's again, nothing fancy at all. Hopper's, I think, essential kind of grasp of the experience of living in a city like New York was really based on that notion of how we experience interior and exterior space. We live and work in these interior spaces. We move between them by going outdoors, but we're always aware of them, looking into the window of a shop, or perhaps catching a furtive glance of somebody who doesn't know we're looking at them. Hopper specifically mentioned that many rides on the elevated railroad, the urban transportation system that had the trains riding above the street level, that in many of those rides he had glimpsed into windows in offices and apartments and homes and whatever as the train moved by, and he would catch these scenes, and he said that then your imagination could sort of work with the subject. Hopper often painted the city not at at noontime or in the glare of an afternoon light, but in the early morning or in the early evening. And there were a number of things that made that appealing for him. One of them, he clearly loved the play of light and shadow that he could get when the sun was low, either in the morning or in the afternoon or early evening. You see that in the wonderful painting called Early Sunday Morning of 1930, a row of just sort of anonymous storefronts, the sun casting these elongated shadows from a barber pole and a hydrant, where it gives us almost kind of, again, a sense of sort of a longing for something that we don't know quite what it is. There's a loneliness there. There are no people present. And that's another thing that Hopper seemed to like, was in the early morning or the early evening, finding places where there was a kind of quiet, a lull, really, in the city. And House at Dusk of 1935 also shows us another interest of his is in that wonderful contrast that he pulls in that painting and in others between the fading natural light, the sun going dim behind that wonderful group of green trees in the park, presumably, and a street light coming on down at the lower right, or the lights that illuminate the rooms in the building that we're looking into. Hopper's paintings have since his own time and continue to be today characterized as expressing, capturing something of a sense of loneliness or isolation. It's difficult to put into words. People have struggled with this in trying to explain the effect that his paintings have. But indeed, it is true that oftentimes there are no people in his paintings, or even perhaps more poignantly, there are often people who don't seem to interact, or the nature of the interaction between them remains unclear to us. In the painting Office at Night, 1940, we see a man at his desk working. Behind him and to the side is presumably his assistant, a woman in an impossibly tight dress who's pulling something out of a filing cabinet and looking over towards perhaps him or perhaps some papers on the floor. And they seem to be, as the title implies, working at night, late. We glimpse them from outside as we pass by, and we imagine that there's something going on, but what it is, Hopper never, ever put in motion a story that came to any foregone conclusion. He himself said, that's just it. That's the beginning of the story, and nothing more is meant. And I think he knew exactly what that allowed for viewers, and that was the possibility of a kind of embodiment of our own ideas about our own lives, our own stories. It wasn't being told a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think part of what he looked for in these images was that possibility of identification. We've all experienced loneliness and isolation. And indeed, certainly one of the conditions of modern life in a great city like New York was literally how you could be alone in a crowd. And his paintings give voice to that in a way I think it's again, almost impossible to articulate in words. Hopper himself once said something to the effect that if I could say it in words, I wouldn't need to paint. Hopper is often referred to as the quintessential American artist. And I think a number of things are perhaps meant by that characterization. First, perhaps most obviously, his subject was America. The houses, the urban scenes, the people, recognizably America, and not grand America, but what people in his day, and we continue today, think of as a kind of common America, the everyday. Hopper was an avid fan of the cinema, and indeed we see that in a very lovely painting called New York Movie of 1939, where we see the interior of a dark theater, but interestingly enough, we can't see any clarity of the image on the screen, so we just know we're in a movie theater, and the only figure that we really can see well at all, other than the shadowy figures in the audience, is the usherette who's leaning against the wall at the right, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. And it's a wonderful kind of dichotomy between the cinema, the place of a kind of escapism, leave the ordinary world and go into this other world, and yet then this other world of her thoughts and her own private dreams or hopes or worries. Hopper was also influenced by cinematography, how sets were created in early films. He was fascinated with film noir, with gangster movies, and in amazing ways he also then, because his art took on qualities that seemed to be cinematic, began to influence filmmakers, particularly in the later 1940s and the 1950s. Nighthawks of 1940 is one of Hopper's most famous, or perhaps indeed his most famous image. It shows a scene of a cafe, a diner at night, And we're looking from outside in the darkness, looking into the illuminated space, and that's all it gives us. And yet it's gone on, and it was instantly recognized when it went on view in 1940 and was acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago as a real masterpiece. Many people know the painting, many people may have seen it, but this is the first time that it's been in Washington ever. So this is a wonderful opportunity. If you want to see a masterpiece among masterpieces, this is the exhibition that presents that opportunity.
All right, so now hopefully you know more about Edward Hopper than you knew 10 minutes ago. One of the things that his art is particularly known for is that there aren't a lot of people in it typically. Sometimes there are no people in it, but usually if there are people, it's only one or two or three people. Some people say his work has a real sense of loneliness to it. Other people argue that and say it's not necessarily so much loneliness, but it's a sense of solitude. Now, for the check-in question, I asked you about the difference between loneliness and solitude, because on the surface, it sort of seems like they're the same thing. Solitariness, loneliness, it's when there's no one else around. But I think a fundamental difference there is that with solitude, it's not necessarily a negative thing. Loneliness is sort of inherently negative. It's sort of inherently sad. It's a bummer to be lonely. But there are people who really like time alone. They like that solitude. They like that solitariness. And in fact, I would argue everyone at some point probably likes that. Whether you like it or not, to some extent, I'm guessing you've all been forced into solitariness and perhaps even loneliness over the last month and a half. The distancing that we've had to do, the time apart that we've spent, especially for some of you that don't have siblings at home, you might be spending all day at home just by yourself. And for some of you, maybe you love that sense of solitariness. For others of you, maybe it's really a sense of loneliness that you're dealing with there. That idea in Hopper's work that comes through of this solitariness, which was something that I think he enjoyed as a person a lot as well, it's going to play a part in this next project that you're going to be doing. I think there are some other interesting tie-ins with what we're going through today in Hopper's work, even just when you look at what New York City looks like right now, without a whole lot of people anywhere except indoors. And a lot of Hopper's stuff, which was painted based on New York City scenes, very rarely showed any crowds. A lot of it looks like it probably could have been done today where so many of these places are empty. This next project is going to be your final project. It's the last thing you're going to do for the year. And you'll see in Google Classroom, there is a sheet there for you that goes through kind of what the whole process of it is going to be. I'm going to kind of just try to quickly run through that with you right now to kind of be sure we're all on the same page of what I'm asking you to do. Basically, I want you to think about the video of Hopper. I want you to think about Hopper's work, and I want you to think about loneliness. I want you to think about solitariness, and then I want you to think about how those ideas relate to what we're facing today in this stupid COVID-19 world. And then consider how those thoughts and ideas relate to the experiences that you've had since mid-March when kind of our whole world changed. And then your task is going to be to express your thoughts and or experiences about solitariness or about loneliness into a piece of art. Here are the guidelines of what I'm asking you to do. First of all, you can use whatever medium you want to. It can be painting, it can be drawing, it can be photography, it can be video, it can be collage, it can be multimedia, it can be sculpture, it can be digital art. Truly, it can be just about anything that you want it to be. I'd encourage you to try to choose a medium that you're interested in, and I'd encourage you to think about what medium might best communicate the idea that you're trying to communicate. Now, your art that you're doing can be objective or it can be non-objective. In other words, you can very realistically, or not so realistically, do a piece of art that shows the view outside of your window, and that's going to be kind of your statement about what you've been looking at for weeks, for months now. Or It can be more abstract or figurative. For example, it could be a painting with no recognizable images, but just colors and shapes and lines that express a sense of loneliness that you've been feeling over the last month and a half. Regardless of what approach you take, I want this art to incorporate specific thoughts related to coronavirus, COVID-19, stay-at-home Minnesota. Either in the images that you're presenting or in the meaning of what you're trying to communicate. In other words, whatever you're presenting about loneliness or about solitariness should not be something that you could have done a year ago at this time. You know, think back to fundamentals of art. Some of you maybe chose loneliness as an emotion for the emotion line assignment. For this assignment, loneliness can be a big component, but I want it to be loneliness in the context of what we're going through right now. I want there to be something specific about it that makes it unique to this time, to this experience we're having. So it's not just about solitariness, it's not just about loneliness, but it's about those things in a coronavirus, COVID-19 world. And by the way, it's not necessarily a negative thing. You may love some aspect of what's happened in the last month. You may have loved the time at home alone. This does not have to be a sad, negative sort of thing. This is your experience. This is your thoughts, and you're choosing how to communicate that and what it is that you're communicating. So don't feel like it has to be a bummer, although it totally can be. Really just depends on what experience and what feelings you want to communicate. I'd encourage you to keep in mind Edward Hopper's quote, "If I could say it in words, there would be no reason to paint." In other words, I want you to try to communicate something that can only be communicated through visual art. Not something where you could have just written it out in words and communicated it just as well. So think about feeling, think about expression, think about what's going to connect with the viewer. But how is this something that can be uniquely communicated better in art than it can be through anything else? I am going to ask you also to turn in an artist statement, very brief, when you turn in the final project. And I'll give you more information about that artist statement next week. This is your final project for the year. Now, it's not a final project in the sense that it's going to be worth 10% of your grade. It will count the same way other projects have counted. We're not going to have a final project worth 10% of your grade. But this is the last project that you're going to get this year. It's due on Friday, May 22nd. I'd encourage you to maybe try to have it done earlier that week, but if you need the time up until that last day of school, that's fine. You can turn it in starting May 19th. That's Tuesday, that last week of school, and so I'll have the upload link that day. So you can turn it in starting then, but it's due by the 22nd. It's going to be worth 60 points, 10 points for time and effort, 10 points for how well you expressed a feeling of loneliness or solitariness and what you've been experiencing, 10% for how effectively you used the medium that you chose, 10 points for your creativity, 10 points for the artist statement that you'll turn in, and then 10 points for the aesthetics or the overall look of the piece. I really want to challenge you to let your unique creativity show through with this. I realize that to some extent you're limited with what you've got available at home, but that's why it can include photography, it can include digital art. You can do it on your computer. And when I say photography, it doesn't necessarily have to be one photograph. It might be a series of photographs. So again, really try to let those creative juices flow. I think we could get some really interesting stuff out of this, and so I hope you'll really try to go beyond just something real obvious and really basic, and make it something unique to you, unique to this experience, and something that is uniquely artistic in what you're presenting. All right, if you've got questions about that, again, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll have some Google Meet times that I'll put in announcements, and we can always set a special one up as well. But if you do want to check in that way, you're welcome to. Otherwise, email me and we can talk through stuff. Don't forget, your expressive self-portraits are due by the end of the day on Wednesday. So be sure that you get those taken care of. And then also by the end of the day Wednesday, I'm asking you to upload a document that just gives me a little bit of information about what you are planning to do for this final project. That doesn't mean you can't shift gears a little bit after you present to me what you want to do, but I do want you to have thought about it and have a game plan by the end of the day on Wednesday, so that I know that by Thursday you're ready to really get rolling on it, because at that point you'll have about a week and a half to work on it. So that's it. Sorry, I know it was a lot of screen time today, so now shut me off and go get to work, and we'll talk soon. See you guys.